Hey everyone, this is the Sig-Auth meeting for October 27th, 2021. We have a pretty light agenda today, but we can go ahead and get started. For the folks that wanted to talk about the volume security standards, are you all here?
Hi.
Did you? I have the doc open if you all want to talk about it. Give the pitch of what you guys are trying to solve.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, so we have this issue, a potential security problem with the volume mode conversion. And we discussed about this approach already in Sig-Auth, so just want to bring it up with Sig-Auth and see what you guys are thinking. Ronak, you want to take it over?
Hey, yeah, sure. So I think Jing has had a bit of conversation in the past with, I think either Sig-Auth or Sig Security about this. And basically we have a small issue or a potential security issue with our volume snapshot feature. And we've been discussing recently about how we would want to sort of address that. So what we want to run by, I think without getting into too much detail about the snapshot issue itself, is actually introducing something called something like volume security standards, basically based off of the pod security standards that was sort of introduced recently, right? So if you can sort of scroll down below the non-goals. Yeah. So so just like how pod security standards sort of introduced like these standards and then sort of a controller to enforce that standards, but also not very limiting in a way. We were thinking of introducing something similar, but related to volumes instead of just pods. So we want to run that by Sig-Auth and sort of get feedback, not now necessarily, but definitely on the document as well, and see like if the direction that we're headed in sort of makes sense. So if I just had to summarize this document, so we wanted to introduce like volume security standards, which are basically right now privileged and restrictive, where privileged would be the least restrictive policy and restrictive would be the most. And right now we just have one use case, right? This snapshot issue that we sort of have known about and want to solve. So it sort of made sense for now to just have like two standards defined. In addition to that, we also wanted to introduce this admission controller. The where to introduce that admission controller it's probably a bit too early to talk about that. It's probably going to come up in the design. But the idea is to have an admission controller, which is going to go ahead and sort of look at the standard and look at the policy that's applied to a particular namespace, and then go ahead and try and enforce that policy. Right, so just like pod security standards and the whole the way that works right now, we were thinking of introducing, excuse me, 3 modes where we have enforce, audit, and warn. And again, if enforce is labeled onto a particular namespace, then those standards applied to that namespace are enforced when this admission controller sort of intercepts calls to create a volume in that particular namespace. If it's audit, then that's going to be just audited. And if it's warn, then if the mode is warn, then we're just going to warn the user, but go ahead with the operation. So a lot of this proposal is, again, based on pod security standards. We also looked at pod security policies or something like pod security policies, but sort of had the idea that, you know, since that was like the community moved on from that in terms of pods, it doesn't make sense to go back to that for volumes. So so yeah, that's actually basically the gist of it. I didn't expect to finish it in like 3 or 4 minutes, but really the idea is to get feedback from Sig-Auth about what they think about something like this applied to volumes, in the sense that when you create a volume, right now our use case is just singular in terms of restoring a PVC from a volume snapshot. but we want to build something that can be extended in the future for other potential sort of security issues or concerns that may come about. So yeah, Jing, anything you think you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I think you covered pretty well. Are there any comments from Sig-Auth?
So I think the main focus would be getting feedback on this document. This is obviously very high level at this point. We're also drafting a KEP, which we probably would share with Sig-Auth as well. But just to get an idea of what you guys thought when you went through pod security standards, and would that be a similar mechanism be applicable to volumes as well?
One of the things that we was probably important when we started with pod security standards was enumerating like the things that we wanted to protect. And so this seems to be like describing a mechanism without a really clear sense of what it's trying to protect against. So there's one example use case here, which like the mismatched mode thing, like getting access to a volume with different modes. But beyond that, it's hard to see like what is being protected against, and so it's hard to map that to like this 3-tier, restricted, baseline, privileged mechanism. Yeah, so I guess the one example use case I'm having a hard time mapping to like how problematic is this? Like running a privileged pod seems pretty clearly privileged. Like accessing a volume with different modes might be okay, but might not be. Like
I think maybe, Rona, can you go over the use case, how this problem was discovered? Maybe move to the beginning. I think we maybe skipped that part.
Yeah, sure. So I think so the one use case that we do have is definitely well defined in the sense. So right now the issue is, and the reason we start thinking about this is that a user can basically create a PVC with a volume mode of block, and then write malformed data to it, and then take a snapshot of this volume. And then when they restore the snapshot as another PVC, they can actually specify the volume mode as file system, right? Even though it was originally a block volume. And then the potential is that when a user uses the second PVC and Kubelet tries to mount it, there could potentially be a crash, right? And the problem that we have is that, as you said, like this is sort of a valid use case as well as an invalid use case, because there are like sort of backup vendors who use this mechanism to sort of perform their backup and restore. So so we can't sort of reject that altogether. But at the same time, there can be like a malicious user that just wants to crash a system. So that's where the sort of dilemma comes in, and that's how we sort of ended up at this whole defining, like how do you define who's a privileged user and who's not, right? Who's allowed to do this operation, who's not? And that's how we got to like this whole namespace level thing.
Yeah. So one of the reasons pod security standards were useful was because there's like 35 different things in the pod spec that like it's just a very huge surface area in terms of the API, and bucketing and simplifying like what a pod can do was valuable. If there's like one problematic scenario and there aren't a lot of other clear scenarios, having like a 3-tier policy mechanism seems like overkill to me.
So Jordan, if you have any other alternatives that we are offered as well, yeah, this is definitely just one case, but because it is a potential security issue, right? So we thought we have to find a way to solve it, but we couldn't find out other way, more simple way to solve this problem. That's why we thought, this pod security standard seems to be a good approach that we could borrow.
I mean, so just straw man proposals. Like if the expectation is that under normal circumstances, a PV won't be like accessed in both block and file system mode. Like it'll be one or the other, or a snapshot. Like if you required some indication on a cluster scoped object that this mixed mode access was okay or expected, that would be one way to do it in a pretty lightweight way.
This is not a cluster scope. This is a user scope. So this is basically a special use case for backup and restore, and backup vendors use this to take efficient backups. So they do use this conversion because normally your volume could be used file system mode, but underneath it is a block. So they convert it temporarily to block during backups. But then when they restore it, of course, it will restore back to its original mode. So it's definitely a convenient way for backup vendors to do efficient backups. But then there is this potential security problem there.
So would that be like something on the volume plugin to say like this volume plugin expects to restore from like block snapshots to file system PVCs?
Well, this is what most plugin would allow. This one normally is not the plugin; it's the backup vendor will be doing this temporary conversion. So it's not like at the CETA driver level actually. So because backup vendor, when they do that operation, it's going to create this a temporary volume and changing that to block mode so they can get the change blocks. So yeah, so it's not something that is controlled by at the driver CETA driver level actually.
If I could ask a question on this, so I think the feedback I'm getting from Jordan is, it seems like you have one very crisp use case, and while it seems probably important to handle it somehow, like there seems to like there is a potential for quite significant harm if it is exploitable. It might not warrant the complexity of something like PSP or pod security standards. I mean, have you considered a much more targeted thing to this problem, like not a generic mechanism, but a targeted like admission controller, either as a webhook or I don't know if it would be in tree or not. But you could imagine that when such an admission controller is enabled, it would by default disallow change in mode unless the actor that was requesting it or some out of band way, like I don't know, some extra permission that the actor has, it's allowed to request it with a different mode than it's supposed to be in. So it would be, like expressed through some, admission restriction in the Kubernetes API, targeted specifically towards this just one use case, right? So the idea being that the backup vendors, their controller or whatever is running that's doing this backup would be obviously given that permission because it's doing a good thing, it's backing up your stuff. But normal users would not be granted that permission. Or maybe they would be under special circumstances where the cluster admin has decided that it's safe, either because the users trust it or the thing that they're interacting with is benign.
Rona, did we consider? I thought we looked into that earlier. Did we? just a simple web controller. I don't remember.
So I think where we got stuck and where we decided to move to like the standards was how do you define who's a sort of privileged or allowed user and who's not, and how do we differentiate like within the same namespace or something like that. And then that's when we moved to this, if I'm not wrong.
So it appears, oh, sorry, Drew.
When storage vendors do this cross-mode snapshot restore, what namespaces are they usually doing that in? Is it the ones the user's stuff is in, or is it in a separate like backup restore controller namespace?
It's a user namespace because they need to backup restore the user workloads.
Okay. If that's the case, then I'm not seeing how a namespace level policy to allow a cross-mode backup restore would be safe. If in order for the vendor to do this cross-mode restore, they have to allow, like set it into privileged mode or something to allow this cross-mode operation, that also gives the user access to do cross-mode operations in that namespace. To me, this really seems specific to the volume type. Like if certain volume storage vendors are expecting to do these cross-mode backup restore, am I misreading that?
Yeah, it's
not an attribute of the volume type?
Well, backup vendor, they do have to do something that is kind of a privileged to make those things happen. But those are the user workloads that they have to, they back up if they are in a user namespace. When they restore, they have to be in a user namespace as well. In the middle, the data will be moved to someplace else in the middle, right? So there's a transition somewhere in the middle. But when they convert this mode, that is the mode is specified on the PVC itself, right? So that's why I'm saying it's a user mode thing. When they change that and then they get the data basically.
Yeah, I guess I'm just not seeing how, like, if the privilege escalation, if we're calling like changing a mode an escalation or a privileged operation, if that is happening in the same namespace that the user has access to, that seems like you're losing whatever protection this is providing for the duration of that operation. If we're concerned about users like maliciously creating a PVC or a snapshot in block mode and writing bad data and then doing something with it, but in order for normal backup restore operations to happen, we have to expose the user namespace to privileged operations.
Oh, so you're saying
that opens a window when the user could do malicious things.
So you're saying user can always do this anyway, doesn't matter. Like even if we have volume security standard, they could still do this. That's what you.
I think what Jordan is saying is the tenancy model of the pod security standards is that it's per namespace. What you're saying is you need to somehow slice up a namespace, but in like a weird transient sort of way, like saying that this privileged actor can somehow change the mode and do special things. But at the same time, like normal users can't leverage that during the duration of the operation. Like maybe if
I'm saying you're saying the namespace once it's applied, then that's like for everybody who has access to that namespace, basically. That's what you.
Yeah, presumably the user who's running the app has access to the namespace to do like appy stuff. So if you're in the middle trying to have like a more privileged actor do something, you can't use the namespace as your tenancy boundary. You have to have some other concept that says that this actor is allowed to do something special, but not some other actor, right? So like an example I know that I remember from OpenShift is the reason the pod security standards have the hard-coded list of like this user is special, as a config flag, is to support OpenShift's build controller, which does privileged operations in shared namespaces with other untrusted tenants, but it does so by very carefully coordinating with the underlying container runtime and the Kubernetes API in a very orchestrated way. But like, it's only safe because they control like the whole vertical stack and they can do that. But it's effectively impossible to guarantee unless you control the whole stack in a very particular way. At least in that particular example.
Okay, so you're saying that it's actually not even possible to secure this one. Then there was even, all right.
Not with a namespace level control. If the backup operation you want to trust and let do privilege things happens in the same namespace as the users that are maybe untrusted.
I see. Okay.
So alternative things to consider are if there is an attribute on a cluster scoped object that could be required to allow this cross mode operation. That's one possibility. Another possibility is some sort of admission check that would actually do an authorization call. So an example of this would be when you sign or approve certificates, we actually do an authorization check to make sure that the API requester signing or approving a certificate has access to that particular signer name. So you could do something similar. You could say, if you're going to mount or restore from a snapshot in a different mode than it was produced, you need to have this authorization. So that there is prior art to that. It gets a little fiddly, but it's doable. I think the question there would be about backwards compatibility. Like if there are people already doing this, what would they have to do or set up in order to continue to be able to do what they had been doing without getting interrupted?
Okay, so about this authorization check, do you have any examples or something?
I'll drop a link to the what we do for the certificates stuff.
Okay.
Can you explain the crash? Is this something that always happens, or is this something that happens in the presence of, common kernel bugs?
This is actually never happened before. This is this is just so actually Yang brought this
theoretical crash. Like it could.
But this this is just a potential. Yeah. So actually Yang brought this up. I think he is reading those kernel, potential kernel bugs. So he was basically saying that if there is so currently there's none. That's why this one is actually kind of we're not saying this is like we have to fix right away. We have, but we can take time to think about how to fix this. But it's just this type of a bug in the kernel. It come, from time to time it shows up. So if there is such a bug, then if someone, write this, malformed data, and then it could potentially cause this to happen. So that's how we come up with this. We actually sent an email to, there was a security group. This was maybe a few months ago. Community security. We actually asked about this problem. But then, I think we were told that, maybe this is not a maybe it's not like urgent or something, right? But we still should look into it. And then when we see the pod security standards, so I thought, oh, maybe this is a good way to solve this. We were having trouble finding a solution for this problem. So,
so if I understand correctly, like if we're looking at the page I have on the screen, the concern is, right, so this is from 2019, so 2 years ago or whatever, but if another CV like this is discovered, or if you're running an old kernel version that isn't patched with this, theoretically, the Kubernetes API through these mechanisms gives you an entry point to cause the kernel to consume a malicious volume, which then could allow you to execute code as the kernel in the kernel, and thus, if you had like a multi-tenant cluster or whatever, that you've broken that tenant boundary, and can possibly do whatever the kubelet is able to do environment.
Yes.
And so it's theoretical in the sense that we're unaware of any current CVEs. It's just that we have an avenue where untrusted data is being provided to the kernel, and we want to limit the opportunity for basically such things to happen to actors that we have some prior trust in. Did that summarize that? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
I put some links in the agenda. Do you want me to add them to the agenda or comments on the snapshot restored doc?
Yeah, if you can add to the doc, that'd be awesome.
Okay.
Yeah, so then we can maybe look at this other, certificates. And also, you also mentioned like cluster level control, maybe if somehow we have some parameter in cluster scope that we can use to check this, like adding another parameter at cluster scope, using that.
I'm trying to remember all the objects involved in a snapshot restore. So PVC and PV, we've made good use of attributes of the persistent volume being outside the namespace and not being under the control of the namespace user. For snapshots, are all of the objects in the same namespace, or are there any cluster scoped objects?
There is a cluster scope object, which is the volume snapshot content, which is similar to PV. And the volume snapshot is namespace, in the same namespace as PVC.
Okay.
It has similar.
So one possibility would be if there's a trusted component that is involved in producing these backups, it could be given access to annotate or set a field on the volume snapshot content to say, this is, even though this was produced in block mode, it's okay to mount back in file system mode. So it seems like it would make sense for the snapshots to record what mode they were produced with. And then under normal circumstances, they should be mounted back in the same mode they were produced with. But if someone wants to produce one with block mode and mount it back in file system mode, that could be okay, but they need to indicate that this is expected and they are trusted and this is not an attack. Okay, so this would be for the backup software who is responsible for taking a snapshot. They can add this annotation on the content. This way they look at that hint, they would know at the restore time, then it's allowed. Something along those lines. Okay. So under normal circumstances, a normal user producing a snapshot doesn't have write access to the cluster scoped snapshot content objects. But a backup controller, like the privileged backup controller for the cluster, could reasonably be given access to those. I see. Yeah, maybe we can explore that. All right. That would be relatively straightforward, actually, if we do that way. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, so we'll look into those two suggestions.
Yeah, I've written down a bunch of notes from what you guys were saying. So I think
Okay.
we definitely have some new avenues to look at as well.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is very helpful.
Yeah, really helpful. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so if you have any other comments, please, add to that doc. So yeah, then I will pin you guys to review when we decide which approach to go.
Cool.
Thank you.
Anything else on this, guys, before we do the discussion topic? Any final comments? Cool. So I just added this one discussion topic. Starting this week, I switched the weekly triage meeting for Sig-Auth to try to focus on 123 stuff because code freeze is coming. So I've just been focusing on that. And during that time, I saw a bunch of stuff with the new pod security stuff. And I just wanted to get an update from Jordan, Tim, anyone else who's been working on it. Is there anything y'all need help with? Is there things that need to be reviewed? Critical items for beta in 123? Anything y'all need?
Things are going pretty well. We're down to about 3 or 4 PRs left before beta promotion. All of those all but one are actually ready for review and in review. So we've got benchmarking in place. The default path when you upgrade an existing cluster to a version that has this feature enabled, where things are privileged by default and pods are allowed, is very, 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 very performant, which makes me happy. Basically takes a couple hundred nanoseconds and like 1 extra allocation for every pod that's admitted. So the impact of enabling this feature on existing clusters is essentially nil. Tim is working on getting the metric stuff in place. Sam was able to get the webhook version building and an image built and manifests put together so that people can install this on existing clusters and try it out. That's the first PR on that list there. So that is in the merge queue. And then there were a couple other things listed under the beta items around like prioritizing which pods we check in a namespace. If there are a bunch of pods, we want to check unique pods first before we start checking like all the pods that came from the same replication controller. But generally it's on track. I would expect the code work to wrap up this week or early next week, and then the docs work to be picked up to update for the docs for the stuff in beta.
So what was there any of these that need an extra review or anything, or are we good?
Right now, everything has an owner and a reviewer. I think probably what I would want help with once the webhook PR merges is people like actually trying it out. Like you can, it's a two line installation. So you make certs and then you control apply, and that installs the webhook into an existing cluster, and you can play around with it. So I would probably, anyone who's interested in engaging and helping, and I would probably get them to do that, play around with it. So I'll plan to send an email to the Sig-Auth mailing list once that merges, and have kind of an open call for that, and link to the docs for that.
Cool. Very exciting. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions or concerns on that? We don't have anything else, so if anyone has anything they want to bring up, we still have time. Guess I can open the CI stuff. I don't think we've looked at it in a while. My CSI driver read Rita.
It might be because of the issue we had with CI. That was impacting a lot of different projects a while back.
Okay, I was just curious.
That would be my first guess, but I need to dig into it.
So you guys, if I remember correctly, though, you successfully did your 1.0 release, right?
Yes.
Very nice. So we, if I understood correctly, you guys went ahead and just promoted the APIs to V1.
That's right.
Awesome.
Per Jordan's suggestion.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'm glad that's all there. I think a lot of folks have been waiting for that. So that's exciting.
Yes, go try it if you haven't. Thank you. And feedback welcome.
I'm trying to look. What is the saying? It's saying there our OIDC discovery thing is not working. So this is recently. Jordan, can you remind me who owns this feature? Like I know Sig-Auth owns it. I mean, who's like person?
Can you zoom in? I can't read what you're looking at.
I just saw Sarah's County Issuer Discovery was failing.
Michael Toffin was the one to set that up. Is that? Huh.
Those all seem recent.
On upgrade. That's interesting. I can never remember which version stable 1 represents. I'm wondering if this is one of those situations where like the E2E test in 122 had test config that was not present in 121, and like it's running the E2E tests from one branch against a cluster configured from another branch.
Doesn't like a good idea to do that. I mean, maybe.
Yeah. I'll ping Michael and see if he can figure out what's going on with that.
Okay. I'm not sure why stateful sets are showing them. I'm not seeing any. I'm not seeing any other sort of repeat offenders other than service account discovery. That's Sig-Auth. So that's good, I guess. Cool. Well, I don't think we have anything else on the agenda. If anyone wants to talk about something real quick, we can. Otherwise, we can keep everyone back 17 minutes. Cool. We'll see y'all in 2 weeks then. Yeah.
Adios.